I've been reading about the history of capitalism and what happens when nations adopt free market policies. And what happens is wealth goes skyrocketing upwards. And it's not just that the rich get richer, it's that everybody gets richer. And then a generation or two later, everyone gets rights. And so that's why in the long run, the world's getting better and better and better. And if we were having this conversation 2 years ago, I would very much agree with my libertarian friends who say, look, I mean, in the broad sweep of history, it's amazing how good everything is. It's amazing what's happening. But there are some interesting paradoxes. There are some interesting ways in which the progress of a free market society creates conditions that undermine either the progress of a free market society or democratic capitalism. And so here's the main one I want to put out here for our discussion. I've spent a lot of time reading the work of the psychologists and sociologists who create the World Values Survey. They survey, it started in Europe, now it's global, every 7 years, that you can see these beautiful maps showing the whole world and where they are on this two-dimensional value space. And so Sweden and Scandinavia in the upper right, that means they have, their values are the most, it's like freedom-loving, emancipative, that's the word, freedom or emancipative values, and they're the most secular rational. So that's Sweden. And then the bottom left, from my perspective here, bottom left is like mostly African and Islamic countries that still have the values appropriate to an agricultural society that has no trust in government, that has no faith that there will be food 6 months from now. So it's very, very different sets of values. As countries get wealthy, they move up and then to the right. They move to that zone where Scandinavia is now. And that's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. What happens is then everyone's values change. In the next generation, they really begin to care a lot more about women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, human rights, the environment. So you get this very progressive shift in values. Okay, so with this sort of audience, I'm sure that all sounds great. So that's step one. But here's step two. Once you have these incredibly prosperous, peaceful, progressive societies, the people there begin to do a few things. First of all, it's not everybody who has those values. It's everybody in the capital city and the university towns. They all have these values. So if you look at our countries, in America, we're like pretty retrograde in some ways, but if you look at our bubble places, they're just like Sweden. And that means that these people now think that, nation states, they're so arbitrary. And, just imagine if there were no countries. It isn't hard to do, Imagine if there was nothing to kill or die for, no religion too. So this is the way the values shift. And so this is what I and others are calling the globalists. Like the new left-right is like the globalists versus the nationalists. And so the globalist ethos is tear down the walls, tear down the borders, nation states are arbitrary. Why should my government privilege the people who happen to be born here rather than people who are much poorer elsewhere? And so you get this globalist idea. You begin to get even a denial of patriotism. The claim, there's some horrible. There's some pictures going around right-wing media now in the United States, protesters, anti-Trump protesters holding up signs that say patriotism is racism. So you get people acting in this globalist way, inviting immigration, spitting on the nation state, spitting on the country and people who are patriotic, and very opposed to assimilation when there is integration, because that, as we say in America, people on the left would say that's cultural genocide. So this is step two, is you get wealthy, wonderful, successful societies that are so attractive to poor people around the world. You get a flood of immigration, and they're met by the globalists who say, welcome, 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 don't assimilate, because we don't want to deny you your culture. And this leads to step three, which is this triggers an incredible emotional reaction in people who have the psychological type known as authoritarianism. Now, it's a very negative term, but there's a lot of psychological diversity in this world. There are some people who are attracted to the Leninist vision, the John Lennon vision. There are other people who are more parochial, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, there are people who really care about hearth and home and God and country, and they are actually friends of order and stability, and they're friends of many good things about civic life. But when they perceive that everybody's coming apart, the moral world is coming apart, that's when they get really racist, homophobic. They want to clamp down. They want to restore moral order. And if anybody here saw Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican National Committee, That's exactly what he said. He modeled himself after Richard Nixon's 1968 speech, a time when cities are burning, there are riots, and Nixon came in, law and order will be restored. And that's basically what Trump's whole speech was. So what I'm saying is, successful democratic capitalist societies they change values, they generate wealth, they invite people in, and then they make some of the people act in ways that trigger the other people to be furious, and those other people actually have a point, because you have to have trust and social capital to have a redistributive welfare state. This is getting a little too complicated. My point is just that, yes, the economy matters, and economic changes matter, but they matter in ways that always run through psychology. In politics, always look for what each side makes sacred. And for anybody who remembers World War II, certainly in Britain and America, the country, the flag, and then freedom, democracy, all these other virtues. And I hope we'll talk about universities in a bit. But the idea of freedom, liberty, and then after World War II, fighting the communists, so the idea of freedom, 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 liberty. So it was a good time to be a liberal. Liberal meant liberty, freedom, fighting for liberty. So the older generation has those values from circling around them during the war and afterwards. But then we get the new left in the 1960s. We get the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s, in 1989, and then into the 90s. And we get a rise, and because I teach at a university, I'm surrounded by this. We get a rise of a new set of sacred values around racism, sexism, oppression, and basically the sacred victim. And this is the clash. This is part of the clash. If you have groups on the left whose essentially their religion is fighting racism, well, that's a very admirable thing to do. But if it becomes a religion, you become fundamentalist, now everything that contradicts that must fall. So just to give a very vivid example, I taught at the University of Virginia for 16 years. My children were born there. I love UVA. And at UVA, we all worship Thomas Jefferson. He was the founder of our university, obviously the writer of the Declaration of Independence. So we worship Thomas Jefferson, and every president of the university who writes something always quotes Thomas Jefferson. Well, all university presidents had to write to their students a day or two afterwards because the students are freaking out, thinking that it's the end of the world, that they're going to be murdered in their sleep by Trumpists. So every university president has to write to the student body to say something without being too political, but acknowledging the pain and trauma. And so the president of UVA quotes Thomas Jefferson. Well, some professors, joined by some students, write an open letter to the president saying, stop quoting Jefferson. Jefferson was a racist, a slave owner, and a rapist. If you quote Thomas Jefferson at a time like this, you are dividing us. Don't do it. Now, this is as sacrilegious as could be. This is like going to church and saying, stop quoting Jesus. Okay? What do you think the parishioners are going to do? So the alumni are furious at this. But my point is, it is like a new religion. And so, but every political movement is like a religion. So, to bring it back to immigration, the new religion, one of the new religions, is all about diversity and inclusion. Now you've got immigrants coming in. My God, we all saw the horrible photos of children dying. Of course you feel sympathy. What do you do about it? Well, if it's your central religion, then of course you welcome them. And if anybody says, oh, you know, they're linked to terrorism, they're forcing us to change our way, if anybody says that, they're a racist. So you have the dawn of this new religion, which in my view is extremely illiberal. And this is one of the things I loved about your book, is that I stopped calling myself a liberal back in the American sense, because we butchered the word, we made it mean left. That was wrong. 100 years ago, liberal meant left. And I was a liberal my whole life until I basically finished The Righteous Mind. And I realized, you know, I gave a chapter to my wife to read, and after explaining the conservative worldview, I said to her, Jane, I don't think I can call myself a liberal, and I'm reading on the left. Because this new illiberal left, I think is you can't have a functioning multi-ethnic society if you have this kind of attitude. So that's the clash we have now over immigration, is if it's a central, basically a religious battleground. So I see two problems in that way of thinking that I see all the time on the left. The first is to start with an economic analysis and to say, well, why are they voting against their interest? And many people on the left don't get, because they are globalists, they don't get that the idea of the nation is something sacred. They don't get ideas of patriotism. So that's the first thing, is to focus on economic analysis. And the second is to act as though the community is just local, because again, they don't get the nation. So I often am told, and whenever I talk about immigration, I get exactly what you said. Well, why is it that the areas with the most immigrants are the most tolerant? Therefore, if we just flood the zone, flood every town with immigrants, they'll all get tolerant. Okay? Now, it's obviously not going to work, in part because we have in America, and I'm sure in Britain too, people move where they feel comfortable. And so people who have a globalist, John Lennon-type brain, if they're born in central Kansas, they're going to get to Chicago as fast as they can, as soon as they can leave home. And then they'll get to New York or London, and vice versa. So people are sorting into the kinds of places that they feel comfortable.
But they've always done that.
Much
so
more
why
now.
Is it so different now?
Much more now. Because now we have the luxury of choosing our lifestyle. Life wasn't that easy where you could just choose. What, so much more now we have assortative moving. And the other thing is I remember after 9/11 happened, and the people in New York and Washington, or in New York especially, were not all gung-ho for war. And I remember some of them saying, why are the people out in the red areas, why are they so upset about this? They weren't even attacked. As though the 9/11 attack happened to New York City and Washington, D.C., not the biggest collective trauma to the United States since 1941. And so there's a kind of a blindness I see over and over again on the left, where they approach things in economic terms. It really is like a color blindness, like they're missing receptors. And I think this is very much a problem with the leaders of the European Union and those who want ever closer union. I think what they're missing is you can have diversity within a shared sense of identity. And if you don't have that shared sense of identity, it's going to be very divisive.